Hello everybody, and welcome to my Rex character guide. To start, yes, he is quite different than the other survivors, but no, he is not weak because of it, just different. Basically, Rex is the epitome of risk versus reward. No pun intended, by the way. If you are not comfortable with spending your health to do damage and doing it constantly, then Rex is going to take some getting used to. Once you get familiar with him, though, he is not only perfectly viable, but also extremely fun to play, so it is well worth it. As always, the information in these guides is meant to supplement your own playstyle and not be the only way to play Rex. It is simply what I've found the most success with and what fits my playstyle the best. We'll begin with an overview on his abilities and general playstyle, ending with a separate section talking about items that perform particularly well on him. In all my other character guides, I end them with some footage of a run to give context for the information I give. However, in this guide, I will omit the gameplay footage at the end, simply because I already have a separate video up covering a great run on him. So if you want to see the gameplay footage, check that video out after the guide. Link is in the top right and the description below. Also, all the footage is taken from my live stream at twitch.tv/Woolie Gaming. So if you're interested in watching me play the game and want to ask some questions or just hang out, you can follow me there. All right, let's begin. As I stated in the intro, Rex is high risk, high reward. This largely comes from his double-edged sword design, where you have to spend a portion of your health to, in return, pump out some pretty massive damage. And when I mean massive, I mean Rex has the highest damage potential of any survivor in the earlier stages without any items. The only contender would be the Artificer, but in ideal situations for both, Rex's damage output definitely takes the cake. However, again, the downside is that your main damage output, your M2, costs health to use. Now, it would be a bit silly to not have any way to get your health back in his kit, aside from natural HP regen, of course, and that's where your M1 and, more importantly, your R come into play. Before I start talking about specific combos, let's cover each ability by themselves. Your M1 is your standard attack, and it fires a 3-round burst. If the final shot in the burst hits an enemy, it heals you for 30% of its damage and applies the weaken debuff to an enemy. This debuff simply reduces their armor, damage, and movement speed by 20%. For most survivors, save for maybe the Artificer, your M1 is your bread and butter. With Rex, this isn't quite the case. You should always be holding your M1 down because you can do pretty much everything while you are firing. However, do not expect the healing to be anything substantial, and think of the weaken debuff as a nice bonus rather than a mechanic you should always be playing around. Again, you should always hold M1, but don't really rely on it too much outside of occasionally healing you and weakening enemies. The main reason for this is that the healing being only 30% of the final shot's damage is quite weak, and especially past the first few stages won't be of an impact at all. Yes, even with capped crit and some shaped glass to boost the damage, it still isn't that much. Also, the proc coefficient on M1 is 0.5, meaning that even if you hit all 3 shots, you still only have about an 88% chance to proc an on-hit at its usual rate. So if you have an ATG missile launcher, which is a 10% chance to proc at all times, landing every shot with M1 means on average your ATG will only proc 8.8% of the time instead of 10. However, the lack of strength in Rex's M1 is easily made up for by his M2. Not only does this ability do a whopping 450% damage, but it also has a less than 1 second cooldown. This is by far Rex's most consistent damage, with the obvious downside of costing a bit of health every time you use it. We'll get into how to play around the health cost here in a bit, but just know that your M2 is your bread and butter, and learning to play around its downside is extremely important to your overall effectiveness on Rex. His shift isn't too special. It simply weakens and pushes away any enemies that are in front of it. However, my main use for shift is not its effects on enemies, but rather the boost it gives you if you are airborne. It essentially pushes you in the opposite direction you cast it while you're airborne, meaning you can do some pretty cool movement around the map using it as like a momentum boost and or like a super jump. It may sound a bit confusing, but basically just look in the opposite direction that you want to go, press spacebar, and then shift, and the skill will push you in that direction with a greater momentum than just running around. It has a relatively short cooldown, meaning that you can do some evasive maneuvering with it as well. Again, you can cheese enemies by shoving them off ledges, but the mobility aspect of the skill is far greater in its overall usefulness in my opinion. Finally, Rex's R shoots a projectile that, on impact with a wall or enemy, sprouts roots and entangles any enemies within its radius, or any enemies that come into its radius after it has already sprouted, meaning it will continually pull in enemies that walk into its effect rather than just the ones that are in its radius initially. It has a tiny bit of damage, but the main draw is the heal you receive for every enemy that is rooted. The skill says every target hit, but even the ones that walk into its radius after the fact will still heal you. Even if the enemies die while inside of the R, it will still heal you as if they were alive. I don't know if this is a bug, but it seems like a Nintendo mechanic, and basically it means that if a proc chain of ukuleles and your other on-hits wipe out the entire group immediately with your R, you'll still receive the healing, which is good. Also, like your M2, this costs a portion of your health to use. Know that both the M2 and R cost current health, meaning you'll never kill yourself with your own abilities. Now, you can go extremely low in health, and thus pretty much any hit will kill you, which in my books is basically the same thing as doing it yourself. But as long as you play around the healing mechanics of your R and don't endlessly spam M2, you should be fine in most situations. Again, your M2 is your bread and butter, and because your R is your primary source of healing, it is by extension your other key skill. As in, don't waste it. If you do, you'll have to change your playstyle quite dramatically until it is back up. Let's talk about how to use your skills in the most effective ways. Again, there is quite a learning curve to Rex due to his health costs. This means recovering those health costs as soon as possible is the primary focus in his playstyle. While M1 does heal you, the amount is negligible when compared to your R, so I like to think of the M1 heal as a nice bonus versus a reliable healing method. This is where your R comes into play. The general idea is that the more enemies that you group together, the more health you will heal, and thus the more you can spam M2. In most situations, enemies will die to like 2 or 3 M2s, especially in the early game, so your playstyle until you activate the teleporter should be to take out the larger threats first, like golems, while keeping small clusters of lesser enemies to constantly shoot your R into. You should only kill the group of monsters once the big threats are taken care of, because you'll want to let your HP recover from the M2 spam, so it's ready for the next time for the next threat. Don't really use your M2 to clean up the weak enemies, rather just use the M1 and make sure to use your shift pretty much off cooldown to use its nice mobility. If you do this correctly, you should recover all the HP you lost in the M2 spam and be perfectly healthy for the next encounter. If you get power hungry and spam M2 for every enemy, you'll quickly find out that your HP is sitting below half of its value pretty much all the time. I don't really have to explain why that's an issue, right? When fighting the teleporter boss, the same idea applies of taking out the larger threats first, but instead of clearing out the small enemies, literally keep them all alive until the boss is dead. This way you will slowly add to its size over time, which in turn gives your R more healing. This enables you to literally spam M2 on the boss until it's dead. No waiting around for your health to recover, save for if you mess up the placement of your R and miss the large majority of enemies. If this sounds like a lot to focus on, it's because it is. Again, Rex is extremely high risk, high reward, so if you're not comfortable with that playstyle, getting used to him will be a challenge. Once you do, however, the benefits of dealing with high threat targets like elite brass contraptions and golems in the blink of an eye is very fun. Let's move on to some great item synergies with Rex. Now, if you haven't gotten the memo yet, Rex needs some healing. Rather, he needs pretty much anything and everything to do with defense. The newly added Topaz Brooch is one of the best feeling items to get early on. The barrier stat is essentially a health pool on top of your regular health, so your abilities will pull from barrier before your health. If you can get 3 or 4 stacks of a brooch, your M2 spam becomes very comfortable, meaning your health will hardly go down if at all, so long as you are continually killing things. With boss fights, it also alleviates a bit of pressure if you miss your R, because you can simply wipe out the group of monsters and then use the barrier it provides you to spam M2 and destroy the boss. However, I'd still recommend keeping groups alive until the boss is dead, because the R is still much more consistent in those situations for healing. The most consistent form of healing, however, is definitely stacking Harvester's Sights with as much crit as possible, so cap it at 100%. Now, I understand getting 100% crit chance isn't an every run type of thing, and even if you do cap it, it probably won't be until like the second, sometimes even third loop or later, but it still doesn't change the fact that this is what you are shooting for. As soon as you get a single scythe, getting max crit should be priority 1. Even if this means picking up an ocular HUD as your equipment, the ability to heal off of your M2 is incredibly powerful. Leeching Seeds are okay early on, but the minuscule 1 HP per hit is not enough to make up for the health cost. Therefore, Harvester's Scythes with as much crit as possible is the go-to method for healing. Yes, there are plenty of other ways to heal, such as medkits and cautious slugs, but both heals are not in effect when you're taking damage. Stacking medkits may seem like an amazing idea because they do proc off of your self damage. However, the heal will be delayed until you stop taking any form of damage, so you can't endlessly spam M2 and expect the medkit to constantly heal you up. They are both still pretty valuable tools to have, especially early on, but in my experience, you are pretty much always using M2 and thus taking damage, so their effectiveness is definitely limited at best. Teddy bears, on the other hand, are without a doubt the best form of mitigation in the game, and this is no exception on Rex. They block the damage to yourself from M2 and R. Need I say anymore? We already know how powerful they are aside from that, so you can easily see their added benefits for Rex. Lastly, the absolute god tier find on Rex would be Rejuvenation Racks. I don't like including red items in my guides because you can't rely on getting them consistently, but the strength of just a single rack on Rex is so powerful. When combined with some other healing, it lets you essentially forget about your health cost entirely and enjoy the sheer power of M2 spam with little to no downside. Absolutely a run-changing item, and thus is a godsend to find. An honorable mention would be the Alien Head, which literally puts your R at perma uptime, but I feel the overall impact of a Reju rack is much greater than Alien Head in the long run. No pun intended again. And that pretty much does it with all the info I wanted to cover with Rex. He is a very challenging character to get started with, but once you learn him, he is very fun to play without a doubt. Again, if you like the info and want to see me play Risk of Rain 2 live, you could check out my stream stream at twitch.tv/Woolie Gaming. Also, consider joining our Discord because I always notify when I go live or when I upload a new video on the Discord. Not to mention we have a lot of memes and discussion on the game as well. So if you want notifications on when I go live or upload a new video, joining the Discord is the best way. Again, if you want to see some Rex gameplay, the link to a very nice run is in the top right as well as the description below. Thank you for watching.